Exactly. Like there's an adrenaline or like a dopamine hit that you get when you like reverse engineer something that you never understood before, and then it leads to like a bug.
And it freaking works.
Yeah,
you know,
yeah,
like,
exactly.
Oh, I love it. Hey guys, our sponsor, Project Discovery, has dropped a new tool in collaboration with Google's own Mandiant team called TLD Finder. Okay, picture the sub finder, but for top-level domains. Need I say any more? Check it out. Alrighty, guys. Today we have Matt Brown with us. Matt, you live pretty close by, 2 hours or so, right?
Yeah, just a little bit under 2.
Nice, man. So he made the drive down to Richmond. Thanks for doing that, and we get to do a nice live in-person version of the pod, which I always look forward to. Those are always a good time. And man, looking at this doc, I'm very excited. But we have to start at the very beginning. A very good place to start, and get a little background about Matt Brown and how you became the hardware hacking specialist that you are.
Yeah, so my experience with cybersecurity and hacking started from a young age. I don't know, I just loved computers and playing around with them at first. And then I one day was at a bookstore and I actually brought my book from when I was 16 years old.
Look at this.
Practical Packet Analysis. So I bought this book, and it was all about using Wireshark and examining all the packets that are flying across the network.
Dude,
and
check this out. They're analyzing HTTP in Wireshark.
Oh, yeah.
You know, like,
oh
my
yeah.
gosh. This is great. I love this.
There was a lot of clear text HTTP flying around back then. And so I got that book, and I was hooked. And so I was just running Wireshark and watching what kind of traffic my computer was generating, and super interested in understanding like every packet, how it works, how TCP, UDP works, all that stuff. And so that's kind of got me hooked. I also tried a little Wi-Fi hacking at home on my parents' WEP.
Oh my gosh,
WEP Wi-Fi network. Back in the day, that was still a thing. So yeah, I mean, obviously super easy, but you felt like this like hacker god when you could like run a program and have it print out the Wi-Fi password in a black terminal, right?
Unbelievable,
so,
man.
Yeah.
I remember the first time I cracked a web network, also my home network at the time.
Yeah.
Man, it what a rush.
Yeah. So following that, I went to college. I started as computer science, later transferred to MIS because I didn't want to take physics 1 and 2 or Calc 3.
Dude, those are so hard, man. But you did CS. I would have assumed that you did like
computer engineering,
right?
Yeah. So I eventually came full circle to that in grad school. But in my undergrad, just got interested in general hacking and security. We had an awesome information security student group at Iowa State, and they were talking my freshman year about all of these session tokens that would be flying around in clear text. And I was also in my first programming class at the time, and it was a Java programming class. So this would have been 2010. Back then, Facebook thought it was a good idea. They had HTTPS on the login page, but nowhere else on the website.
Oh my gosh.
So, and later on, no joke, Facebook made it an optional feature. You could drill down into the settings of your Facebook account and optionally opt into HTTPS everywhere.
No way. In the actual settings for that?
Yeah, on the settings for your account.
That's crazy.
You could opt into this technology called,
dude.
So
at that
HTTPS
point, there
or
was
SSL.
session tokens and stuff like that flying around in plain text for Facebook.
They were flying around, and on college campus at the time, encrypted Wi-Fi was not as popular. So,
oh my gosh, you could just hop on and man in the middle.
Open Wi-Fi, so literally flying through the air were session tokens, and so I might have grabbed a couple of those from my friends' Facebook browser, sessions, and popped their Facebook accounts.
Wow,
pretty
dude.
sure it's more than 7 years ago.
Statute of limitations.
yeah, it's all gone. So
wow, dude, that's crazy, man. Yeah, it was the wild, wild west, and I remember. One of the first things I did in college was we had like a computer science 101 course, and they were supposed to like have you. You're supposed to build something. It was a very like abstract assignment. They're like, build something and like present it for everybody. And we're like, okay, sure. And so what we did was we built a system where we would get FTP credentials as they were coming over the wire. And we demoed this whole like hack, and this person would log in with FTP, and then the hacker would like grab it and that sort of thing. And with man in the middle. And our professor walks up to us afterwards and he's like, that was great. You guys don't have to come to class for the rest of the semester if you want. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I love you so much. He was like a TA, he's like a grad student, like a PhD student that was teaching this course. So yeah, lots of good times with that. But I actually thought that the days of, seeing that sort of stuff, being able to proxy and man in the middle and get all those tokens were gone. But actually we've got some exciting stuff on the dock today about that. So we'll swing back around to that. Yeah. So you're in college, you're stealing, Facebook, your text credentials and that sort of thing.
Freshman year, sophomore year, they started to actually crack down on that. But yeah, and the other really cool thing we had at college were these cyber defense competitions.
I love those, man.
You'd be given about a month to prepare. They give you a bunch of VMs with a bunch of holes in them, purposely put there, web apps vulnerable to all sorts of stuff. And you had to go and secure those. And then they brought in real world pen testers, professional pen testers to come and like test you for 8 hours on a Saturday.
What was those called? Those competitions? Because I competed in it as well. But
there's a few different levels of them. Yeah. So Iowa State does their own at the college I was at. Cool. But there are a like national collegiate cyber defense competition.
I can't remember the name of it, but it was so much fun, man, because the one we did, you could be on the offensive or you could be on the defensive. So you've got to balance your time between hacking other people's stuff and securing your own stuff.
Oh, that's awesome.
And it was pretty cool. It was really fun.
That was cool. So yeah, my experience at Iowa State is as an undergrad, I was on the defensive side. You couldn't go hang out with the red teamers.
Gotcha.
But in grad school, they let some of the grad students go and hang with the professional pen testers and be on the red team. And that's where a lot of my offensive skills came from and my start to professional pen testing.
Wow, it's cool because you get to work right alongside, pro pen testers. That's a really cool opportunity. I'm glad to hear college was good for you with that. I really, for me, like my college experience was very much like trying to claw some semblance of cybersecurity into my curriculum, because the only piece of curriculum we had at the time for cybersecurity was this one course where it was all like theoretical cybersecurity. They're like, here's what this is, but no hands-on, nothing. Right. And so I went to the professor and I was like, please, like, let me do some labs every couple of weeks. And she's like, sure, no problem. Like, and so we were able to do that, and we got the cybersecurity club up and running, and then we were able to get some good labs in place. But it's good to hear that some universities, especially earlier on too, were doing that at a good level and getting students into this sort of thing.
Yeah, no, that was a big thing. Doug Jacobson, he's the head of the information security department at Iowa State. He was kind of been on the forefront of that, focusing on practical education. Yeah, for engineers, not theoretical, stuff, but actually hands-on.
At the end of the day, college, it's kind of hard for the colleges to keep up with the pace of IT. But at the end of the day, if you actually have your hands on something and you're actually doing something, you're going to get some semblance of experience, right? Rather than theoretical stuff. So I would definitely rather have older material that is, might be a little bit out of date, but is hands-on, than cutting edge stuff and not hands-on education.
I agree.
So I'm not a whole fan of the whole college process anyway, but whatever. Okay. So fast forward, do you jump right into red team stuff as you come out of college, or how does that go?
Yeah. So speaking of all those competitions, I also won a forensics competition that Lockheed Martin put on.
Oh,
and
nice.
That brought me to a job opportunity that was out in the Northern Virginia area here. Mm-hmm, so that's what brought my family out here. It wasn't exactly the best job for me. So I hopped around to some startups and then I got a job opportunity to actually move back into IoT hacking, which had always been a side passion project of mine, but now I got to do it professionally, which was a pretty big blessing.
That's awesome, man. Okay. And then fast forward a little bit. Our paths have not crossed to this point.
Yeah.
And then I go to this live hacking event in 2023, and Joel and I are hacking on an IoT device. We're crushing it. We've got shells. We're so pleased. And then we show up to this event, and freaking there's like rumors going around like Matt Brown, he's get shells, random induction, shells for days, and we're like, what's going on? And you had so many bugs at that event, man. You guys absolutely crushed it. So that was my first introduction to you there, and you guys walked away with the MBH that time.
We did. My first experience, this is probably not the normal bug bounty path, but my first ever submitted bugs were at the live hacking event.
Oh my gosh.
That I got the MBH at. So that was an interesting introduction to bug bounty, for sure.
You got +1 into that event?
I did, yeah. So random deduction. Jessie, she invited me on, found me through my YouTube channel.
Nice.
So I know we've been talking a bunch about content creation.
Yeah.
And so she found me through a YouTube video where I was doing some firmware extraction on an Amazon Echo device. And that happened to be related to the target of this event. And so, and this event was made for a hardware hacker, right? Because I think it was HackerOne's first hardware only, or that was the majority of the scope for this event. So, definitely an event that was made for me.
Dude, that was very much so one of my favorite events that I've ever been to, just because it's a different skill set for me. And I got to also see Joel really shine in his area, that he really loves. So, what a great memory that one. And we definitely want to have random deduction Jessie on as well. I've talked to her a couple times about coming on the pod. So we got to get that on the books, because she's also got a tremendous amount of knowledge in a variety of areas, not even just, IoT and hardware hacking stuff, but outside of that as well. So I guess clearly you had some experience with network pen testing from the competitions. You, did some practical packet analysis. So we got some binary level stuff, protocols, that sort of thing. What other pieces did you kind of pull together? Because IoT hacking is such a challenging specialization because of the fact that it's so broad. You have to have some reverse engineering. You have to have some, networking experience. You've got to have web stuff. You've got to be able to do source code review, and then hardware, obviously hardware, right? And so where did you get the web hacking skills and the other components that you need to be able to do the stuff you do today?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think what makes me good at all this hardware stuff, and like you said, or hacking an IoT system, because it's not just the hardware device, right? There's there's a mobile app that controls it, and then there's talking web APIs, and there's all these different components. And I just feel like over my time in technology, I've fought tooth and nail to try to be as much of a generalist as I can, and to understand a whole breadth of technologies, and not be like I'm the hardware only guy, because there are some hardware security only people out there who are finding bugs in Intel or AMD chips, right? That's not how deep I go into the hardware side of things. Yeah. I like to understand the IoT system as a system where there is a embedded device, with code to reverse engineer that has network services that's communicating over the network. So you have data in transit and stored, right? And so it's a cool way for me to get to keep learning about all these different technologies, because I just love learning about technology. I think that's what got me interested in this and computers at a young age, because there was kind of this limitless exploration you could do into the digital world,
all the various components. That's one of the things that we've got here as well on the schedule to talk about is IoT hacking as a specialization. I think is underrepresented in the bug bounty community. I think it's really hard to find good hardware hackers that will go and hack on these programs. And I think one of the number one problems with it is, and why there aren't more people going down that path, is it's really hard because you are constantly learning, and you are constantly, having to use all of this information from all the various different disciplines of hacking. To attack the holistic system that is an IoT device, because there's going to be a user interface, there's going to be backend services that are listening, there's going to be, local privilege escalations, right? That sort of thing. So it's so expansive. But yeah, I guess that makes sense that it's really well fitted towards somebody who wants to be a generalist, or someone that wants to be a lifelong learner and always come up against stuff that they don't fully understand.
Yeah. No. Some of the funnest bugs to find are when I have to develop a new skill.
Oh, yeah.
In order to attack
How
the problem.
rewarding is that too,
Yeah,
man?
yeah, exactly. Like there's an adrenaline or like a dopamine hit that you get when you like reverse engineer something that you never understood before, and then it leads to like a bug.
And then it freaking
or
works.
Yeah,
like,
exactly.
I love it. Yep. Yeah, I talked about this bug in my DEF CON talk. And it was the first time that I'd ever like written a Python script from the spec to exploit a binary protocol.
Oh yeah.
And I was like, man, it just feels like I'm gonna get something wrong here. And of course, like I had to tweak in a couple places, but eventually, like within like an hour, it was working. And I was like, whoa, this is this is not magic. Like they actually just built it like the spec. Yeah, man, so rewarding. So yeah, I'm just looking at this list of cross field knowledge that I had here, and there's so many people. I mean, like we were talking about earlier today, without giving too much information away, but there's a mobile hacking component too to a lot of these IoT devices, because they'll be running off of like some bastardized version of Android, right? And they've got like all these like super weird APKs that have no UI and are just like a service running in the background, all sorts of things on there. So there's a component to that too. And then there's the hardware hacking piece, the web hacking, all of those. So lots of really cool pieces that come into the whole IoT system.
Yeah, I would say to that point, and to somebody who is intimidated by hacking on an IoT target because of that, like you can bring your one expertise in one of those areas to bear on the target. And I think I get into this in the doc, but the hardware hacking skills, all this super technical advanced stuff, it gives you more attack surface to look at, right? So you had Jason Haddix on and to talk about the whole recon thing and how it just gives you more stuff to hack on.
Dude,
right?
I love that you listen and can quote every episode of this podcast. He's quoted like 4 or 5 episodes today just in our like 2 hours of conversation. So I think I'm
caught up. I think I'm caught up on all the episodes.
Gosh, dude.
So there's an interesting analogy. It's not going to be perfect, but in the hardware world, right? The more you dig into the hardware, so like I don't dig into the hardware for the hardware's sake. I dig into it to find bugs, oftentimes in the actual software running on the device, or in a mobile application or a mobile API that is in this whole IoT system, right? And like I think of it
it's recon, right?
Yeah,
I mean, it is recon for these IoT devices, for you to be able to understand what you're actually working on, because at the end of the day, the most impact is going to be some remote vulnerability, right?
Yep.
That can allow you to pwn the IoT device, right? And if it's a remote vulnerability, it's coming from some, service that's sitting on that device that you can interact with. And for that, you need to get your hands on what that software is.
Yep.
And that's the goal of a lot of the hardware hacking piece, right? Is to be able to get at that, internal firmware and understand what's happening there a little bit better.
Absolutely. Yeah. So like every IoT hacking exercise starts out as a black box assessment. You have this device sitting in front of you, you know nothing about it. You can maybe like interact with some of the network services over the network, but you don't really know what's going on inside. The hardware hacking, the firmware extraction, the getting a UART shell on the device, those are all tools that's going to turn that black box assessment a little bit more into a gray or a white box assessment and get you access to more stuff to hack on.
Absolutely. Okay. So just talking about IoT hacking as a specialization again, the first problem that I mentioned, I wanted to bring a couple of these problems to you that I think present themselves to hackers trying to get into IoT hacking as a specialization. The first one, of course, was the breadth of knowledge that you needed. But the other one that I had here was how much upstart time there is to find a vulnerability, right? So me as a web guy, and I struggle with this all the time because of the concept of opportunity cost, right? Like, do I just log into a web application and start churning attack vectors, right, on that web application and start churning out bugs? Or do I spend, for me, what often turns into be, 16, 24 hours of work hours, like working specifically on extracting the firmware, getting my hands on like something so where I can actually start even testing these hardware devices, right? So I guess how do you address that, and how do you weigh obviously there's a lot of passion for IoT devices with you, but how do you weigh the pros and cons of that? And do you have any advice to hackers that are just coming up and starting to come into IoT hacking on the cost of even getting started?
Yeah. So I guess the one thing is when you look at bounty tables, a good program is going to have much higher bounty tables for the device category than, it's usually device, mobile, web is what you kind of see a tier system. So there is more of an investment and there is a risk to your time, right? You're talking about that opportunity cost. There absolutely is. But oftentimes what I think you find at the end of that exercise is a lot of untouched scope because of that barrier to entry.
That's big.
So I like an analogy in the mobile space is, mobile APIs are not as tested as much as your web APIs because there's this barrier to entry of unpinning the app, right? In an even greater sense, there's a bigger barrier to entry in the hardware world, but there's APIs that device interacts with or services that run on the device that no one has ever really assessed.
Ever.
Because maybe they had a pen test one time and the pen tester clicked scan against the IP of this system and no real assessment with any reverse engineering or understanding of what's going on the device.
Wow, sometimes these devices that make their way into bug bounty programs, they could actually be completely unassessed.
They could.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's crazy, man. Yeah, no, that makes sense. There's definitely a good amount of reward there. And I like what you said about having higher hardware bounty tables. I think that's really good. I think also, and this is something we'll cover a little bit later on as well, but I think people coming from the web or mobile world, even talented hackers in those spaces, have a hard time with attack vector ideation for hardware devices. What actually constitutes a vulnerability, in a hardware device. So I think that's another challenging piece of it. So if you can nail that down, you can start thinking, okay, well, maybe I could get that, 8K medium, that there is in the device world versus 1,000, right, in the web world. And so that, I think that
I think you've said it on the podcast as a full-time bug bounty. You're I'll report a low or a medium, right?
I don't care, man.
I'll do that all day long, especially when those bounty tables are advantageous for me. A handful of mediums, I'm all in for that.
You're all set. I mean, you're out earning some crits on web scope oftentimes.
Yeah, and especially when you think about the CVSS, I think I mentioned this in the doc, right? As hardware hackers, a lot of times, yes, of course, we'd love our attack to be remote, or over the network. But a lot of the times we're sitting in that adjacent category. And so it's sometimes hard to get the high or the crit you need, especially when those other categories.
Yeah, man, I haven't had a bunch of experience with CVSS scoring hardware vulnerabilities. I mean, how does it do?
It is not as built out for the hardware scope. It just isn't. And the result of that, good programs, what a good bug bounty program will do is they'll say, yeah, we understand there's this CVSS thing, but we understand the threat model of our device better. And things that might have technically been, a high got called a crit or medium get called a high because they understand the context that device lives in.
Yeah.
I haven't had too many programs be super strict about CVSS. They usually have their own internal rating system.
So I'm wondering how doing something like providing a initial research stipend for hardware hackers would really, I think for me, that would be an extremely motivating thing, right? So if a program comes on and says hey, we're going to be offering $1,000, $2,000 to anybody who accepts the hardware devices and says we're going to give it a shot, right?
Yep.
And I think these people have to be vetted, hardware hackers, right? They're people that are actually interested in hacking it or whatever. But I think that extra $2,000 would really help because that gives you a couple days of all right, well, there goes the opportunity cost problem that I had. And even at the end of those couple of days, I could write up my approach to doing this so that the team, if they're really interested in securing it, could actually put some, blockers in place, like an encrypted partition or whatever. And then, so there'd be benefit for them on that front as well. But then that also solves some of the upstart problem for us. And then we can start zoning in a little bit more on the actual hacking portion of that rather than just the setup. But also on the other side of this, Matt, I've seen some of your videos where you go from 0 to I have firmware in an hour and a half. So I think maybe it could also be a skill issue, on this side where it takes me 8 hours to 16 hours to actually get firmware.
Yeah.
So I mean, how often do you? Let me ask you that, because you've assessed a ton of hardware devices. What is your, if you had to just sort of roughshod it, what is your average time to firmware?
Yeah, so I'm always going to go down a cascading list of steps that are more and more extreme in nature to get at that firmware, right? Like, because first, if I can get a UART shell on a device, that gives me more than just firmware, because that gives me the ability to debug the device while it is running, and that has even more benefits. That allows me to, understand. It makes it much more, again, gray or white box of an assessment than that completely black box assessment, or if I'm just doing static firmware analysis. If I can't get that, then I am going to go to that method of pulling a chip off of a device. And yeah, I guess that is a thing that helps over time with experience, that I've just pulled enough devices out of e-waste. I mean, that's literally how I practice this stuff, is I find devices out of e-waste, Goodwill, or if you have a workwaste that has a big e-waste bin, you just grab a bunch of devices, and then you don't care if you brick it, right?
Right.
You can practice, desoldering and soldering the chip back on all day long.
But you only get one shot though, too, if you just have one copy of it, right? Like
that's right.
That's the thing that it gives me anxiety. Like, I loved an event where they gave us like 6 of the devices.
Yeah.
I was like, 6? This is great. I can brick 3 of these and be totally fine. Like, I just felt so much more emboldened at that event to like try stuff and not be anxious about it, especially when these devices can be pretty expensive. But yeah, no, I think that's a great approach to like learn how to, pull chips off and stuff like that, is doing the e-waste thing. That's pretty solid.
Yeah, and the other thing you get out of targeting those devices, or like older Wi-Fi routers you get off of eBay, you do get softer targets to look at to kind of build up those hardware reverse engineering, exploitation skills that if you're in a live hacking event, the device is going to be a little bit more hardened than your average device that you pick up out of an e-waste bin, right? Yeah,
for sure. But you still get surprised what you see sometimes.
You do.
Not naming any names, but there have been events where that has been really surprising to me. All right. So one last little problem with IoT hacking as a specialization that I want to discuss was like, it costs a lot of money to get started in IoT hacking, right? Like, so this is mostly oriented, this question is mostly oriented towards like, or for the people that are already experienced web or mobile hackers that want to also get into this space, right? You have to buy a ton of devices and a ton of like equipment and all that sort of thing, which can get pretty expensive on just the upstart cost before you can even have a device to hack.
Yeah.
Do you think, what do you think is like the bare minimum setup? And what are you doing with that bare minimum setup to get started with the hardware hacking stuff? Speaking to, an experienced mobile or web pen tester.
Yeah, so I would say, there are tiers that you can get into of like more advanced gear, but you do not need to start there, right? There are some basic devices, equipment that you can get to get yourself started. And I go back to what I said about IoT testing. It starts as black box, and you can start an IoT assessment or, bug bounty hunting on a device without any of this hardware hacking gear. It's only going to get you more insight into hacking the device. But I would say the first thing.
Well, let me. You said that before, and you've said that even off air before this when we were talking. But I want to double click into that a little bit. Like, what are you doing? Are you just like and mapping it and like looking at the services and like playing around with if you're going to do a true black box assessment like that without any hardware hacking stuff, like what would that look like?
So sometimes you'll find web interfaces, right? And so as a web hacker, you're like, oh, hey, web interface just on an embedded device. I understand that. And it's just a web server that might have command injection because they do sketchy stuff.
They do sketchy stuff,
and maybe it's running as root. Who knows?
Never seen that before, have you?
No, never. Yeah, that's why you mentioned privilege escalation. That doesn't really happen very often in IoT because if you get a shell, you're just like you're a root. It's impossible to do privilege escalation. Some of them are so immune because everything runs as root.
Everything just is root. That's hilarious, dude.
So
so you're hacking the web application. What else you got?
Yeah. So the other thing, it goes all back to my roots.
Practical
of
packet
data,
analysis.
data in transit, right?
Okay.
So not just targeting the system and what services it has, but what is that system communicating over the internet to its cloud servers, to its APIs and stuff like that? Is it shooting data over the network in clear text HTTP? Like imagine, like back in the day, back in the golden age of Facebook, account pwning, there are still IoT devices that will just blast data over the internet in clear text. And so all sorts of consequences that you can have that will come from that. And then you take that data and you're learning more and more about the device and about the whole IoT system as a whole. And then if it's encrypted, are they doing certificate validation correctly? So all the stuff that we're probably going to get into about certificate validation in the TLS context or the SSL context, that can all be done in a completely black box test. You can have no access to the device and attempt to man in the middle of the traffic that is flying over the network out to some.
And then if you see anything, then you can start playing around with, okay, well, I've got an access token here, or maybe I don't even see any traffic here, but I see the SSL certificate, host name or whatever, right? And I start playing around with that server.
And that all gives you stuff to keep in your notes, because then when you do get the firmware, the first thing you want to do, if you see an SSL connection to a server, you're like, okay, I have a host name. Now can I go into the firmware and find out where that request is being generated? What binary, what program is creating that request?
Play the find the request game.
Yeah,
I love that from Sam Erb. Like that was one of the pivotal moments for me collaborating with Sam Erb. Was like, he's like, yeah, whenever I'm reversing enterprise software, I always play the can I find this request game where I see some request that comes through. And then I go into the software, that we've reverse engineered, whatever, figure out where that request originated from and trace it all through. And that's the same thing we do there. That makes sense. I didn't even really think about the fact. See, this is what I'm talking about. Like just understanding how the various attack perspectives even for these IoT devices, right? Because you've got adjacent network, right? You're on the same LAN, and can you pwn it from there? Can you pwn it with physical access to the device? Can you pwn the server that's communicating with the device? That there is no user LAN thing even really. Like this is the device calling back to its home server. So there's lots of different perspectives from which you can Bluetooth.
Bluetooth again. That adjacent network context that includes Bluetooth, Wi-Fi, all of those type of protocols.
So not even just LAN or like Wi-Fi related stuff, internet related stuff.
Yeah, that's all categorized in CVSS as adjacent networks. So that all is really good scope to hammer on.
The Bluetooth stuff is really interesting too, man. I thought that it was going to be a lot more complicated than it was when I took a look at it. It is not that hard to get upstarted in that with just like a mobile app that you can install on your phone and just write various properties into this,
NRF Connect.
Yeah,
on any mobile phone, iOS or Android. Although iOS has some weird permissions that it won't let you see the MAC address of the device you're connecting with, but you can still like communicate with it. Yeah, it's iOS being iOS.
Really? Oh my gosh.
Yeah, it'll show some weird UUID or UID or whatever. It won't actually show you the MAC address of the device. They're like, no, you are not allowed to see that.
You are not allowed. Freaking Apple, man.
Classic Apple.
Okay, so the next section that I wanted to hop into was this one regarding one of your recent videos, decrypting SSL to Chinese cloud servers. That did really well, by the way. Congratulations on that video doing so well. And one of the things you cover in that is exactly what you were just talking about a moment ago, of bumping SSL on these IoT devices and getting access to the communications from that device, calling home, sending data out the back door, that sort of thing. So for me, the way that I understood how that would work normally was I need something like a Wi-Fi pineapple or some malicious router device that I can use to, make this router connect to that router, right? Or whatever, and send the traffic through that, and then have it come back to my computer or whatever. And that scared me a little bit because it's a lot of like, all right, now I got to get a malicious router and I got to set all that up. But when I looked at the way you did it in this video, it was freaking beautiful, man. There's like a 15-line config file that you wrote that does everything. And it was just awesome. So could you talk a little bit about that methodology and what kind of equipment / setup you need to do something like that?
Absolutely. So yeah, that tool on GitHub is called Man in the Middle Router. It's all it's doing is it's, duct taping together a few different open source Linux utilities that when they're brought together are going to effectively do the same thing a Wi-Fi Pineapple is going to do. It's going to set up an access point with whatever SSID, password, encryption type you want. And then it's going to, and then optionally my program, you can also have like a USB to Ethernet dongle. So if you have an Ethernet based device, it can feed into this same network.
Yeah, that's kind of the way that I thought that you would do it, was you would just take like an Ethernet cable and put it on the WAN port of your router or whatever, if you're attacking a router, and then have that go through something. So when you're attacking routers, is that normally the way you do it, or do you like link one router to the other somehow?
Yeah. So with this Man in the Middle Router program, it's actually making my Linux computer into a router. By kind of, again, it's kind of cobbling together a router, but because basically all that a router does, I mean, it does some other things, but the bare minimum that a router needs, it needs to, spin up a Wi-Fi hotspot, right? So we can do that with host APD.
Okay.
And all your Wi-Fi routers, 95% of them are doing that under the hood anyway, just with some web GUI or a mobile app that controls it. But,
which you figure out once you've shelled enough of them.
Yeah. You're like, where's the host APD file and the SSID and password? That's clear text on the device or whatever, right? So there's that. And then we have some IP tables rules that are going to like pass the traffic, that are going to forward the traffic out to whatever your WAN interface is. And in the context of my program, the WAN interface means whatever interface on your computer has internet already, right? So you could be connected to Wi-Fi, Ethernet, whatever, on the upstream side. And then optionally, I have a bunch of IP tables rules that can take traffic that's egressing out of there and say, no, don't go out. Come over to my TLS proxy that's going to man in the middle all that traffic.
Perfect.
And so in that place of that proxy program, you can run any number of things. So Burp Suite can run in transparent mode. So you need a transparent proxy.
Right.
So you can use Kaido, but you have to put something else in front of it, like man in the middle proxy. So you can have man in the middle proxy, which is a transparent proxy, and use Kaido as an upstream.
Okay.
Yep. Or this new tool that a researcher named Oppo gave a DEF CON talk on, which is called certmitm. And,
so cool.
And the advantage to this certmitm tool is that it will try to intercept the requests with a number of different tests. So like, let's say that the IoT device was merely checking that your cert was signed by a CA authority that it trusted, but it didn't check the name, the CN, the common name of the certificate. So if you had a cert like attacker.nmat.com that was signed by Let's Encrypt, and that device trusts Let's Encrypt, well, then he's got a test for that where you can load in your Let's Encrypt signed cert, and then it will perform these tests. But it will perform all the tests, and then the other really cool thing this tool does is if it fails to intercept, right? If the device is properly performing certificate validation, it will then let it pass through. Because what you'll find a lot of time on an IoT device is maybe the device will make request 1, it'll get a response, it'll parse it, and then it'll make request 2. And then, same thing, and then request 3. But maybe it's only request 3 that has a certificate validation issue. Well, if you're just if you're just doing this attack over and over again on the first request, the IoT device is never going to move through to that state where it's making that next request. Yeah.
Because there's lots of different, I mean, it seemed, when I was reviewing this talk, I was amazed because this is essentially like access control. Like my web brain says, this is access control validation for SSL. Essentially there's so many things. You would just assume that, I don't know why I would assume this because it's such a terrible thing to assume, but that, something at that lower level is going through all the checks and is sticking to the spec or whatever. But that's never what we've seen ever in the history of security.
It's quite the opposite.
It's just so smart to look at all these edge cases. You can really, when you watch the video, you can see how he is intimately familiar with TLS and familiar with all of the different spots along the way where, edges could be cut, corners could be cut, and you're not actually, doing the full validation. And then he built this into this super easy to use tool. So I'll definitely be using that, I think, in the future for this sort of thing. Because if you can bump SSL on those sort of things, it's very impactful to be able to see what is actually happening between the device and the call home server. There's so much weird shit that happens there that they never expect you to see.
Exactly.
Ever.
Yeah. And again, it's all this untouched scope a lot of the times.
Yeah. The piece that you mentioned about it passing through is so brilliant as well, because they abuse the retry parts of TLS where they're like, oh, okay, something funky happened that time. Let's just retry it, right?
Yeah.
So he's like, do something funky. Most of the time they don't like it if I do it more than like 3 or 4 times. So I'm going to let them through on this one, but I'm going to get them on the next one. It was very well built. I've got in here the various lists of attacks that they do with this software. Very cool. Shout out also to Lupin who brought this to me. When it was first released, it was like, dude, this is crazy. Like all of these mobile apps are like not doing any validation at all. Yeah. And I was like, oh, okay, cool, Lupin. And I never went back to it until I watched this video and I was like, oh, of course, like IoT, man in the middling, this makes so much sense. So yeah, Lupin, you were early on that, man. You rocked it. So just coming back to your router thing really quick. Yeah. You've got this beautiful, the thing's like 15 lines, but it spins up a DNS mask, thing to deal with DHCP. Yeah. And then you've got that's
the part I left out about what you need in a router. You need a DHCP server because who does static IPs nowadays?
Right, exactly. So you've got your DHCP, 3 lines of DNS mask config. You've got your host APD, like 10 lines of config. I just wanted to give you a public shout out here on this because this shows true understanding and true mastery of these things when you're able to make it this bare bones and this simple, right? Because as hackers, the more complexity we have, the more noise that we have, it prevents us from seeing the edge cases and the what's truly happening, behind the scenes, right? Yeah. So when you have something so simple and beautiful that just routes everything through, it just makes me so happy. So when I saw this, I was really, really excited. And I think that this reduces a lot of the friction needed to start man in the middling these IoT devices. So thank you so much for that. And then I just want to clarify some of the requirements for this. So obviously you need a Linux device, right? Whether that's going to be a Linux desktop or a laptop. You probably need something dual booted, so it's actually at the OS level.
You could in theory do this on a VM. You just need to do USB pass through.
Yeah. I need to figure out how to do this with WSL because I've switched to WSL and it's a little bit dicey, man.
No promises on WSL.
Seriously, and it works so well, 90% of the time. But there's just that little extra bit that I'm like, wouldn't it be really cool if I could do this? But this really needs to be native Linux sort of thing. So I do miss my dual booted computer for that. So
I will say as a hardware hacker, being native on Linux, it makes sense for me because that's where I live. Most of the devices I'm targeting, if they're not a microcontroller, they are Linux based or some Android, some derivative.
Your videos are really good too. What are you using for your window manager within Linux?
Oh yeah, so I run Arch Linux like a crazy person.
Oh, you got a guy running Arch Linux by the way. Here.
And I run i3, which is a tiling window manager.
Solid.
I'm basically a complete Linux snob when it comes to all that stuff.
When you said Arch and i3, I was like, okay, get off my podcast. Okay, and the other things you need, do you need any sort of special wireless card for this? I feel like this is not something that you can do normally.
You don't, but in practice, you might want one. Laptop Wi-Fi drivers. I have experienced this with the poor triagers who have had to triage my bugs that involve Wi-Fi. I'm sorry for that. It's who knows what your Wi-Fi driver, what capabilities it will have and won't have on Linux. And so what I like to use always for the Wi-Fi, just for consistent experience, is a good Alpha. So Alpha makes USB wireless cards. And you want to get one, and again, Linux Wi-Fi, this is a pain. You want to get one with a MediaTek driver. So I can give you a link to leave in the show notes if people want a good suggestion for that.
I see these. Yeah, I've seen these before.
Yeah. So,
Alpha ALFA.
Yeah, so those are pretty much the hacker go-to. And if you have a MediaTek chipset, it will work out of the box on pretty much any Linux distro. And because you need different capabilities depending on which attack you're doing. For this setup, for the man-in-the-middle router setup, you just need to be able to put it into master mode, which is like AP mode in Linux. But if you want to do Wi-Fi hacking, then you might want to do things like have packet injection, where you can spoof the MAC address that it's sending as and things like that. So there are different attacks, and though that adapter is going to,
it's pretty versatile.
Is going to be used for any of that stuff.
You had also here on the sort of list of requirements for this a USB to Ethernet adapter, and I'm wondering why you do that, because I feel like you can just use your Ethernet port oftentimes to be able to. You can use your onboard Ethernet if you aren't already using that for
for
assuming
your
you have a wireless card.
So I'm usually like sitting at my desk at home, and I have Ethernet just because it's more reliable, and so my upstream internet will be taking up the Ethernet.
Gotcha. So you want to have another one.
Yeah,
that makes sense. Very cool, man. Yeah, no, there's lots of uses for all of this stuff as well. Lots of ways you can apply it. So I think it's worth the investment for me to grab one of these alpha cards just for consistency as well. And I'll keep that in mind. You said it was MediaTek drivers.
The MediaTek drivers are much better on Linux. Yeah, you'll have all sorts of problems with other wireless drivers. It's one of those things on Linux.
Yeah, I appreciate that you speak to that,
rough.
Because whenever you get those sort of incompatibilities, I think those are the times when I've been the most frustrated in my entire life.
Yep.
Is when I've got something like a driver or like some device that just won't freaking work between like freaking Ubuntu. It's like, this is like the most popular Linux distro.
Exactly.
Like, how am I having this problem, right? And I think there have been times where I've literally spent multiple days trying to deal with just setup issues like that.
Yep.
And I just have to walk away. I don't ever get that frustrated.
No, and it definitely drives people away from the Linux community, but
yeah, it does.
What are you going to do?
Yeah, you got to figure it out, And then I think once you get a better understanding of some of these things, you go through that trial by fire, it becomes a lot more doable. And I haven't run into issues like that in a couple of years. And I'm really grateful for that, because it's a pain in the ass sometimes. For me, it's actually a lot of times it's dual booting stuff. I'll get myself into a pickle with like grub and like trying to get things to like, I just hate it.
Or you'll update Windows and it'll like,
that's exactly what it did, man.
It'll be like grub. You don't need this.
Yeah. Like, what is that? I am the only operating system.
Yeah, clearly you don't need this.
Windows. Come on.
Yeah.
All right, man. Yeah, I think for any of you, I'll just shout to the audience real quick. For any of you that haven't seen this video, decrypting SSL to Chinese cloud servers, it's a really, it's a very niche thing that he's working on here. But I think a lot of the principles are very widely applicable to IoT hacking. So if you're looking to man in the middle these devices, I think this is a really cool video for that. So we'll link that down in the description as well. Definitely check that out. The next section that I wanted to move on to was the general IoT hacking methodology. I've been holding off asking you questions today as we've been hanging out a little bit before this episode, but I'm really excited to dive into this. So when you are approaching a device, obviously you've got your ways of getting a shell on the device prior to pulling the chip off, right? You've got your UART, you've got JTAG, you got like glitching into those two things, right?
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering what do you try before you switch to a chip off methodology and effectively brick your device there? But we'll come back to that because there are some nuances with that. Yeah.
Oh yeah. So UART is always going to be my first goal on any device. I guess we got to talk about devices in two different categories, because one, there's a microcontroller, based device, and then a more like a rich OS like Linux or Android or something like that. And so I treat those two very differently in my process. A microcontroller, if you found the lucky device that they didn't disable JTAG on, then you can use JTAG to dump the firmware. And that is the way to dump the firmware. And then if JTAG is locked, then glitching is the way to glitch the system into unlocking JTAG or the read whatever readout, protocol is being used. So, but that methodology I am not experienced with. I tend to favor and target the Linux-based devices a lot more. Glitching is something I want to learn and get into more.
Yeah,
it's a very advanced skill. And kind of like I talked about how there's people who just focus on like hardware security. There are people who like everything they do is glitching chips and pulling firmware off of them and reverse engineering microcontrollers.
When you're talking about microcontrollers versus, I guess, microcomputers or like micro actual, Linux systems.
Yes.
I mean, even on some of these boards, there may not even be a core OS for you to get very much off of, right?
Correct.
It's just like a board, with its own firmware attached to it there, not running a very minimized version of Linux, like which is what we often see. And then, even further, there's like, okay, you're actually running like a stripped down version of Android or whatever. Yeah. That's a good differentiation. I like that.
I will say in the microcontroller case, I might even tend to jump to chip off faster if, and this is a big if, so microcontrollers have built-in flash. Pretty much all of them do.
Yeah.
But they optionally can have external flash. And so if it's external flash, then it's just a flash chip like any other flash chip. You can pull it off, pop it in your universal programmer, and you can read that firmware out.
So I've never hacked a microcontroller. I've always hacked microcomputers, stripped down Linux versions or whatever. Yeah. So when you're dealing with a microcontroller, what kind of stuff can you expect to get off?
Not very much. Not very much without, again, very involved reverse engineering, which, again, being really honest, like in a bug bounty context where you are considering ROI and like time, money, like is this going to pay off? It might not, right? It might not. Okay. There is a case, though. There are always exceptions to these rules because I believe the bug of mine that we're going to talk about that was performed on a microcontroller. Cool. So occasionally you can find files or something like that. But what you're going to be looking at, the firmware, is going to be a binary blob. Because if you think about what a microcontroller is, again, I'm from the Linux world. Right. So I think of everything through that lens. So how I like to think of a microcontroller is it's one static program. Think if there was only one process.
One ELF, binary
exactly.
or whatever.
And when you boot up the processor, it starts the program. And when that program exits, the CPU halts.
Wow.
Right? Like that. And so that's why, when you're coding a microcontroller, you have like an infinite loop.
Right.
And then you call various threads or do your stuff. But it's always running that one process.
So hard for me to think about that even. I so think about that whole ecosystem from a Linux and OS perspective as well.
And you think that there's this thing called a file system, which sometimes they build in, sometimes there are these microprocessor OSs, where they will build out the concept of a file system that can exist on a microcontroller, but most of the time that's not a thing.
Jeez, dude, that's crazy. So a lot of this stuff is just getting held in memory, and
yeah. But if you can extract that firmware and you see things like secrets or certificates, like we'll talk about in our finding down the road. You can maybe do something with that. Maybe you can do firmware modification. Maybe you can grab those secrets and then, or URLs, right? If you see API endpoints, any kind of clear text string, you're going to look at that. And
strings is your friend there, right? No. DD and strings is your friend there.
People ask me all the time, like, oh, you're this like really advanced like IoT hacker. How do you find that password in that program? Did you reverse engineer it? I ran strings on it. Like half the time, literally the first thing I do if I get a binary blob, I run strings, pipe it into less, and then I just hit the down page button on my keyboard.
What are you doing with less, man? You got to pipe it into a Vim buffer, and then it oh geez, what are we doing?
I know.
Oh my gosh. Okay, so very good differentiation. I'm really glad you brought that up because those are definitely two different worlds, right?
Yeah. So back to the Linux path, because I think this is where some of these skills really come into use more. So my first goal is UART, because UART gives me more than just the firmware if I get a good UART shell. So when you find your UART interface, right? UART is a serial protocol that allows you to communicate over, some digital signal over a voltage, maybe usually 3.3 volts. So you connect up your cable. So we go back to what equipment do you need? My first piece of hardware hacking equipment I would ever suggest is a multimeter and a 3.3 volt UART to USB cable.
Yeah.
That is going to help you get so much on so many devices that
Yeah.
the ROI on that is just
That seems,
incredible.
and it's like a $15 cable, and it's pretty universal too. You know, any hardware hacker that I've talked to is like, yeah, man, just get a multimeter and a UART cable, and you know, you're good a very large portion of the time.
Yeah, like maybe a soldering iron, because sometimes they take they don't populate the pins in the production devices, so you have to put a little, you know, like, you know, half a cent pin and solder it on. But yeah.
So when you're identifying UART, are you often doing that from the data sheet, or are you just kind of like poking around on the device with the multimeter? Are you, I mean, obviously you know, after a little while, you kind of get a trained eye for it. You can say, okay, that's like 4 to 6 pins or whatever right there. And it's 4 to 6, right? No, it can be less than that too.
It depends, but if you see two things that look like connectors on the board, the one with more pins is JTAG, the one with less is UART. But yeah, it's all pattern recognition. Like, I can just look at a board and be like, okay, there's the flash, there's the RAM, there's the CPU. You know, over time you do get that trained eye, and that's why I really always suggest people go dig through e-waste and just like open up devices. Even if you just open up the device and look at it, you're gaining something, because you're looking and you identify the components on the board. Yeah. Because you're getting those reps in to be like, okay, there's UART, there's the flash chip. Those are the things that I care about.
This is the same thing we tell new web hackers is you don't even have to hack anything. You don't have to try anything. Just start looking at HTTP requests as they come through the proxy and start understanding what that does as correlated to the action that you just performed in the web browser, right? If you can categorize those requests and start understanding, okay, anything Sentry related, you know, or whatever, like that's metrics. I don't need to look at that super much. It's funny because that contradicts what I said last week about Sentry being an interesting attack surface, which it is. But you see, you know, if you're focusing
not for the new hackers,
right?
Exactly.
If you're a new hacker, you want to, you know, zone right in on the functional API that's targeting the main website, right? And I think this is the hardware version of that, of like break these things open, start identifying all the various components, know that's a flash chip, know that might be a UART connector, you know, that sort of thing.
Exactly. Yeah. The things I'm looking for on a board are UART and the flash chip. That's it. On a Linux-based system, I'm not really worried about JTAG at all. Honestly, I'm just kind of leaving that by the wayside. With UART, then I'm if I see something that I think is UART, I'm turning on that device. I'm probing with my multimeter with ground. I find ground somewhere. Wi-Fi antennas are always connected to ground. You find shields that are grounded, and I'm probing the pins to find a voltage that fluctuates, especially on boot, and that's probably the transmit pin. And then usually next door to that pin, to the right or the left. I found weird devices where it's somewhere else. You'll find the receive pin where you from your UART cable are going to transmit to it.
So you've got transmit, you've got receive, you've got some voltage one. What is the?
So you don't need VCC. That's VCC. Only if you're going to be powering the device over the UART cable, which usually doesn't work anyway. Sure. So you actually want to just completely ignore that.
Yeah, and sometimes I think people have been like, don't mess with that port because it'll blow if you hook it up to the wrong thing, it'll like screw your USB port on your laptop.
It might do something bad. Yeah. Just leave it alone.
Don't touch that, Justin, is what I've heard. Okay, cool. So you identify that. You give that a shot. That doesn't work. JTAG is disabled. You could go the glitching route, but more often we're going to go the chip off route.
Exactly.
And so that process, as far as I know about it, and maybe you can sort of walk me through that, is you get like a hot air station, and you are, you know, fluxing this thing up, the flash chip. You have to identify the flash chip first, right?
Yep.
You're hitting it with hot air until you're able to pull it off, right?
Yes.
And then you're cleaning the chip off, getting it in good shape, putting it into a chip reader.
Yeah.
And then hopefully you'll be able to just read that chip just like the actual system would as it's booting up. And then you can, you know, access all the various partitions and file structures that they have on that device. How often is it that simple?
I would say it is usually that simple, assuming that you have the right reader. So almost like step 0 in that process before I ever shoot hot air, and I talk about this on my videos, is just like read the serial number on the chip and make sure you have the right device like to take it off. Because especially in the context, right, where you are new and starting out, you don't want to unnecessarily brick a device because you pulled the chip off and you're like, oh well, I don't have a reader for this now, and I gotta go order one from China or whatever.
It's gonna take 2 weeks.
It's gonna take a long time to get here. So I would identify. I always read the chip serial, or the identify, the model number. I go and I look in my software. So the chip reader I use for everything that's not eMMC based stuff is going to be the XGeku T56. That is a universal programmer. It's got tons of different sockets that it can fit into it. It actually does do eMMC chips now.
I was going to say, so if you're not talking about an eMMC chip, what is this, like a flash chip that what is this other alternative? I've only hacked eMMC.
Yeah,
chip.
So eMMC is only on like high-end Android devices, or like, it's usually where you're going to have more storage on board the system. Cheaper IoT devices are going to have NAND flash chips, or even SPI flash, which are just slower, right? And usually don't have as much capacity. They can.
eMMC chips, they kind of hook up. I mean, you can almost, I've seen some people mention that you can kind of wire them into an SD card reader itself. Like you can literally connect some of the pieces on the what are they called, the plates or whatever, on those directly into a USB to micro USB converter, and it'll read like an SD card.
It fundamentally is an SD card in a different shape.
So cool.
Yeah. So that's pretty cool about that. And then there's this new kind of chip called UFS, which it looks exactly like eMMC, but your normal eMMC reader can't read it. So I ran into that before.
Oh man, yeah, that's tricky.
But those I've got another reader for that. But again, I'd say this XGeku platform it's got some sketchy like Chinese software that you have to run in Windows, or I run it under Wine because I'm I like to stay in Linux, right?
Oh, okay.
Yeah. But I. I'm a snob. It's okay. I'll own it. I like that programmer because it does the widest amount of types of chips out there, and I just have to get one device. I have to buy new sockets occasionally to fit different chips and stuff like that.
Yeah, because there's like little molds or whatever, right? That or at least this is my experience with the eMMC chips, where you have to get it in a specific mold, and then you put it in there, and that aligns everything properly so it can read up through those ports. You need some specialized stuff for that. So
So in the like electrical engineering world, it's called the package. So the package type defines like the shape. It defines the geometry of the chip, and then eMMC is even weirder because you'll have the same pinout on the bottom, but there'll be different dimensions of the chip. And then so you'll have these different like guiding rails that you put into your eMMC reader.
That's what I'm talking about. Okay. And so in the NAND flash world, or in those other things, you actually have to have the layout of the pins is different on the bottom. And so you actually have to have specialized adapters for that, or?
Yeah. So the universal programmer, it has basically a set interface, and then it has different sockets that all fit this one common interface. And so the software inside this universal programmer is smart enough to know, like, you configure the software. So instead of like the eMMC reader where you can just like, it just can mount onto your Linux computer, like it's a mass storage device or an SD card, right? These other types of reads, you have to read it out through the software, and it literally just gives you the firmware file. And it's not partitioned, so you have to go through there and use binwalk. Usually you can use binwalk, and it'll just extract the file systems that are
gotcha
there.
So you're getting just a big blob out of that, and then you're not actually looking at a whole file system or whatever. You're having to extract that file system, and binwalk can get messy sometimes too, man.
It can. There's another tool called Unblob. I swear every like 6 months I will like curse binwalk and be like, I need to just not do anything else for like at least a quarter, and just like program a new tool that does it better.
A new binwalk. Yeah, dude, it's probably so much harder than we think it is. Like,
it is.
Thank
I've
you,
looked into
binwalk.
it.
I'm so sorry. Like, you are amazing.
Yeah, they are. They're awesome.
That's great. Okay, so we go down that process. We do the chip off. We load it up into our reader. We get either this big blob, and we binwalk it, extract the file system, or we just mount it like an SD card and read off all the various partitions or whatever. We look around, we identify the main partition, we start, we can mount it, just CD into it, start playing around, start reading all these config files, grepping for secrets, getting our hands on source code, hopefully. So once we do that, are you like, where do you go post exploitation most of the time? Are you looking at like network services? Are you looking at the way that device communicates back up to the home, the mother server, whatever, that's running this fleet of IoT devices? What is your go-to approach from there?
Yeah, so it's definitely contextualized based on the IoT device, but I'd say those are my two approaches, right?
Okay.
It's what network services are available on the device and what communications, again, like data in transit. I love looking and understanding data in transit. And if I have a device where it is doing all the SSL verification correctly, and I haven't yet been able to peek inside of that traffic, I can either statically analyze the firmware to understand what types of requests can be made to those cloud servers, or if I've got the skills to reattach the chip, I can patch in my own CA certificate, and then I can put the chip back on, and now it trusts my certificate. And now I can use man-in-the-middle proxy. I can use whatever one of those transparent proxies to intercept the TLS.
We're gonna talk about the BGA reballing and that chip remounting later. So we'll hold that for now.
But that applies to any kind of chip.
Yeah,
that technique will apply to any kind of chip, which is way easier when it's not BGA, right? So think a spy flash chip just has 8 legs. Gosh. It just has 8 legs. Yeah, it doesn't have 153 pin pads at the bottom, and the legs are exposed on the sides of the chip. So these are probably like the easiest to
I was gonna say
solder, you don't even need a hot air gun. You could just one at a time with a soldering iron reattach.
Solder on
them. Yeah. You could do that to put it back on.
I've actually seen some hackers get like these little mini clips that they use to like clip onto those legs, and then you can just essentially, like, because it's just electrical signals going over reading out of there. So when it boots up, you can just sloop and just slurp up the data.
Yeah, so you can do that.
I love my technical hacker, sound that I made. Slurp. No, that's great.
That's awesome. So those clips, there's some pros and cons of those. So obviously, if it works, the pro is you didn't have to desolder the chip off the board, and you still have a functional device, right?
Right.
The con is that sometimes when you're doing that read, it actually is sending power from your reader, and it's trying to, because it is powering on the chip, and sometimes it can like inadvertently power on different circuits, but in an unexpected way, and it just won't either won't work. I mean, in really rare cases, you might blow something, but that probably not.
Okay.
And
there
also, are some times where you just have to chip off it.
Yeah,
practically.
The equipment is pretty expensive, I think, for that too. So I think especially when it's simple and you've got 8 points that you need to solder back on. Yeah, it may not be that bad of an idea to just pull it off and then resolder it back on afterwards.
Yeah.
Especially once you get a little bit more familiar with how to do this soldering thing. Because for me, I mean, the only soldering experience that I have is getting essentially soldering on those little connectors so you can connect up to UART or whatever, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that's a little bit more intimidating to me. Yeah. But I think that would be a fun one.
Is the magic
Flux is the key, man.
Of all the reattachment, right? Flux is just this magical substance that makes the solder go where it's supposed to go.
Dude,
right?
I think every hardware hacker has like this amazing image of Flux. Everyone's like, man, they'll just sit down and I'll be like, hey guys, let's talk about hardware hacking. They're like, have you ever heard of Flux? Like, Flux is the shit, dude. Like, it just makes everything. I'm like, okay, listen, guys. Like, can we move along from the Flux, please? It's so funny, dude. Okay, so I guess I'm gonna push you again on that last question now. Yeah. So if you had to pick one or the other, let's say it is a call home device. So there is some sort of cloud management. Are you first going to go after the network service, or are you going to go after the call home stuff?
I think this goes back to how I think. I am always interested in data in transit. And so I'm always going to look at that traffic going out and trying to understand those APIs,
sure.
Right?
I think that's where the impact is too, because if you can pop something up in the cloud, then you can pwn all the devices.
Exactly. Imagine if there's like in those call home API requests, there's an IDOR, and now you can make a request on behalf of any device.
Imagine that.
I know,
there would be an IDOR in those devices.
I know, right? Yeah. So that you're right. That's where the bigger impact can lie, and so that's where I want to target first. But the network services, I mean, again, I'm going to be doing all these in my assessment, going slowing down every track.
Once you get firmware, how important is it to you to get a dynamic shell? Like, so you can do dynamic analysis of what's happening on the device.
It's moderately important.
Okay.
I can totally, do static reverse engineering all day. I like doing, static analysis. I actually really rarely will connect up GDB, but RCE isn't my best Vuln class, actually, that I'm the best at. So I'm better at like reverse engineering weird binary protocols. I don't know. Like I said, I get that. I get the dopamine rush from when the only thing standing in between you and absolutely pwning something is understanding how the stupid custom protocol that some engineer invented out of whole cloth, right?
Yeah, rolled their own crypto and everything into it. It's like, oh my God. That makes sense. Okay, so moderately important to get a shell.
But it does help. It has huge benefits, right? Because sometimes you'll be doing your static analysis and you'll be like, I just don't understand, or maybe Ghidra or whatever other reverse engineering binary reversing tool is giving you a pain in one spot. And if you can just log into that shell and see what's actually going on the device, like, oh, it's writing a file here, but I don't really understand what the file contents look like. I could spend 8 hours reverse engineering the static binary to figure out what it's writing into that file, or I can just go log into the shell and like look at what it's writing into the file, right?
Yeah, man, it's so helpful. Once we had like the device that I'm talking about, it was I know what you're talking about. Just getting the shell, dude, was just unbelievably helpful. Like, and I know I did another interview with one of the guys from Pwn to Own Synology, and he talked about the importance of getting dynamic analysis on these devices, because he's specifically looking for RCE 0 days. And you really have to be able to get in there and sort of dynamically debug. It's just going to save you so much time. So I think depending on what kind of approach you have, there's a different route that you might take there. But I definitely think
for that exploit development, that is necessary. I would say it's necessary to get that.
So it depends on your goal. If you're looking for a 0 day on the device firmware, that's good. But I think oftentimes in a bug bounty context, we're just looking for maximum impact, right? So getting an IDOR in the mother server of these IoT devices, right? Is actually way more impactful, because not only can we just pop this one device, but we can pop all the devices potentially. I like that. Okay, so I wanted to ask you this one as well. What does, after you're on the device, you've got some grip on the device, whether it be firmware, whether it be a dynamic shell, whatever. What kind of post-exploitation attack vectors do we need to think about there? Like you mentioned getting access to, API keys or whatever, so we can talk to the mother server. What other things might web hackers and mobile hackers that aren't thinking in this IoT hacking realm yet not realize is extremely important when actually, the rubber meets the road? You've got the firmware, now it's Vuln time. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. No, I would say, the attack surface is, we've already talked about data in transit. We talked about network services. I would say within that category of network services, right, you have the common network services that they're going to be more used to, the web-based ones. And then there's going to be all this custom stuff that's going to lead them into binary reverse engineering and just to understand how the whole system works. There's a lot of binary reverse engineering. You're very rarely going to find... I say this, and I know what you're going to think when I say this. You're very rarely going to find Python on an IoT device. Oh,
man. Yeah. Yep.
But sometimes there's an exception to every rule, right?
Yeah.
I'm like, who puts that? Because it's slow. It's slow compared to C, slow. Right? And that's why they don't do it. But maybe when you have a lot of resources on a system, it's fine. But the other thing that I'm looking at is, again, thinking in that adjacent category, Bluetooth, right? Bluetooth, Wi-Fi, any kind of RF that chips that are on the device, that there is code on the device that will process that input and give an output, right?
So breaking this down, you're saying don't necessarily just focus on the communication, the HTTP based oftentimes communication between the device and the mother server, or just focusing on the web application that's being exposed on this device. Also look at these more binary level protocols and understand what function these play in the bigger ecosystem of the device, right? And how to affect the business logic use cases of this device via those protocols.
Absolutely. And yeah, it's especially in those protocols where you will find that the only security that is being implemented is security through obscurity, right? It's just that, oh, this is a weird custom protocol or process or something like that. And that's really what's providing the security to the system.
I've seen this so much too. Like sometimes these things will literally just shell out, to a binary that's on the system. And it's like, oh my gosh. So just diving deeper into what's happening on the back end of all of these services and even on the web stuff, really, really impactful. And then I think also sometimes there's like device to device communication that's happening.
Yeah.
If you've got like a mobile app that can also connect to this, diving into that mobile app and then understanding how that communication is happening, Bluetooth or whatever.
The other day, I was literally testing an IoT device, and I also was listening to Spotify, which will scan your local network, which will broadcast across your local network and look for UPnP services running on devices. And it was like contacting this IoT device that I was looking at, and I'm like, what the heck? Like,
Spotify, please stop that.
yeah. But it's like, oh, okay, there's UPnP on this service. So yeah, there is, again, in that local network context, you're right. So mobile app communications to the device or device to device communications. If you have, so for that, you want to think of if there's a company that has multiple devices that are in this ecosystem where they talk to each other and they have all these cool integrations with each other, you might have to go buy another device to observe. There might be a code path that you will never actually see until you possess this other device and put it on the same network, and then they all of a sudden start talking to each other.
I'll be explicit about this because it's a well-known protocol that's way out there, but Amazon's Sidewalk protocol is really interesting because it essentially is trying to replicate what they've done with the Find Your iPhone, network essentially of devices that have this device-to-device communication that provides very minimal data, but will also allow you to just sort of identify your device wherever it is.
Yeah.
And I was reading the spec for this thing and it's like, whoa, this is super weird. Because there's a white paper out there. You can read the whole thing. They're very public about how this is a secure protocol.
Yeah.
But essentially it's allowing your phone that has no relationship to this other device or whatever other device to send HTTP requests as a proxy through these Amazon devices. I'm like, wow, this is like SSRF. If I could figure out a way to get this to connect to any host, this is really bad. And obviously, they've done their due diligence trying to engineer it in a way that is, more secure for that. But that was a real eye opener for me as it pertains to device-to-device communication and what kind of stuff they try to build into these to create these seamless product experiences that we take for granted in a lot of contexts, like the Spotify thing, right? Where it's communicating with all the other, Google Home devices that are allowing me to control my Spotify from any device in the house, You take that stuff for granted, but then when you start assessing those sort of products, it's like, oh, this is really sketchy.
Yeah. Another thing I want to mention, talking about strategy when I'm going after a device. I think it was on your last podcast you talked about the pros and the cons of the setup process or the initialization of an account and whether or not you should focus on that. I will say in the IoT context, there are some bugs or there are some requests that will only go out the first time the device ever is set up.
Yeah.
And there's a lot you can learn from that. I found a device that even after factory reset, it would never again send an HTTP request because it kept something in the firmware that persisted, that some piece of information in the firmware that persisted across factory reset. So I only caught the request using my man-in-the-middle router setup the first time the device ever connected to the internet.
That's cool.
So but with IoT devices, another big, maybe I'd call this an attack vector, but the bootstrapping process. How does the device get its initial connection to the internet, right? So there's a lot of different choices that an IoT manufacturer, here we're considering a Wi-Fi based IoT device, right? So that device obviously needs some way to get your Wi-Fi SSID and password so that it can connect to your network. And once it does that, it can talk to its cloud servers and it's off to the races. But that bootstrapping process of how the device gets added And again, this is never going to be some remote exploit. This is
Sure.
going to be network adjacent or physical or something like that, or local network. Some devices will spin up their own Wi-Fi access point that then has like some API that you then feed it the SSID and password. And if you can jump on there and access some other API endpoint,
and like services are exposed on that interface or something like that. It's like, oh my gosh,
absolutely,
that's crazy.
Or just I mean, there's even the risk of most devices are moving away from that because it's almost a design flaw. I find myself in IoT systems. I don't know. I feel like I'm psychoanalyzing the developers of these IoT systems because I'll find these bugs that I'm like, there's just no way to fix this unless you like scrap the project because it's from the design phase. They did something that necessitated initially trusting something that is untrusted. Again, this bootstrapping process of how do I get this device connected the first time? Another class of vulnerabilities that's like that is squatting on a serial number. So let's say the device, once it connects to its cloud or its mothership, right? It says, here's my serial number. Please add me to this user's account. Well, what's stopping me from just hitting that API and registering every, sequential, and the serial numbers are usually sequential, right? And registering every device to my account. And then when the actual user goes, it says, this device is already registered, right? And some denial of service in that.
And wow, see that's exactly what I'm talking about, right? Like that is the sort of attack vector stuff that I love to hear on this podcast, right? like the stuff that you wouldn't necessarily, or you've developed over years of working on this stuff that is more specific to these hardware devices and the way that they interact with all these services. Excellent. I love that. What a cool idea. And then also there's also the resale approach to this as well. If you do a factory reset or whatever, I don't know if this is an accepted bug or not, but if you do a factory reset on this device, right, and you sell it, and then you are able to maintain a serial number, a key, or something like that, that then allows you to take over that device after somebody else has used it again. Like, are those sort of bugs accepted, or like, what's your experience?
I don't know about bug bounty programs accepting those findings. I have definitely talked on my YouTube channel at length because, again, I get devices out of e-waste and then I present them on my YouTube channel, and that is some of the occasional times where I need to censor things in my video.
Seeing that,
because if I grab some device that's added, like you can, again, we're talking about host APD, right? If I can get into that firmware and find that host APD config file, it's going to have the SSID and the password in there, or other credentials and stuff like that.
Yeah, I think in one of the videos you said, like, guys, this is why we shred devices when we get rid of them. Like, this is why you never resell the device if you care about your security, because here's this person's access key, or whatever.
Yeah, there's a popular IoT device out there, which I won't name, that if you sell it on eBay, others can buy it. And if you perform chip off and you go into that host APD file and you find its SSID and password, then there's this attack vector where you using maybe man-in-the-middle router, you set up a Wi-Fi access point with that same SSID and password. Well, now that device is going to happily connect and have internet access again. And what if that device still has fresh tokens on it? Where that device now grants you access to somebody's account.
Oh my gosh, dude. That's
that
crazy.
May or may not be a thing out there.
Who knows? Who knows? I don't know how in depth we'll go with this question, but if you've got anything on this, great. If not, we'll move along. But I wanted to ask, so like we talked about already on the pod a decent bit, these attacks that we're doing on IoT devices are often limited to adjacent network or local, right? Let's say we've got a local device. What are some ways that you have been able to pivot this more into an adjacent or remote environment? Is there? I know it's kind of a very product specific question, and I think probably if I were to answer it myself, what I would say is you have to have a thorough understanding of the application you're hacking to understand how to hit those code paths. But I'm wondering if you had any tricks up your sleeve with regards to this, because things do get rated much lower, right?
They do, and that is unfortunate. One thing I've tried to do in the past with mixed success, let's say I have a network service that maybe is intended only to be accessed on the local network. And I find a vulnerability in that. But I can prove through using like Shodan or Census.io that a bunch of people are port forwarding to this. And I actually see real IoT devices of this manufacturer. Cool. And I like, so what I have to do then is find some fingerprint that makes a good search on those platforms, and I can prove, say, no, there are actually remotely exploitable devices of this type with this service that are on the internet.
And several thousand of them sometimes. Yeah, I've definitely seen that. And actually, when you said that, it made me think about something. I did hear at a talk recently at RVASec, the Richmond security conference, talking about how a lot of these devices have UFW or whatever set up for, firewall on their WAN interface, and you can't access all these ports. But then on the IPv6 interface, they don't have any firewall, right? So you can interact with all of these services that are just binded to, star or whatever to every interface over IPv6 and get access to all of these internal services that are not listening on the IPv4. So I just, and apparently that was a massive trend. The guys that were talking about it at the talk, they did a bunch of router exploitation, and they saw that a lot, which I was like, that is terrifying. As we move to IPv6, what kind of stuff we might run into with that.
Yeah, Microsoft just had their big IPv6 bug. I don't know if we're ready for IPv6.
I don't know, man. It's gonna be a doozy for sure.
Yeah.
All right. Last one I had in this section was, what is one area that you could grow in as a hardware hacker? What are you trying to grow in?
Oh, yeah. That's like I mentioned before, it's microcontrollers and glitching. So they're I am not associated with them at all, but Hextree.io has some pretty sweet hardware hacking content coming out. And definitely when there's a lull in the action for me, I want to start digging into that content because again, like I said, in the microcontroller context, that's my weaker area as opposed to Linux-based devices. And oftentimes a necessity to extracting the firmware from those devices is glitching.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I think they're running a glitching workshop or something like that at DEF CON this year.
They were, yeah.
So bummed I didn't make it to that, man. DEF CON is such a difficult thing as a content creator as well, because you're pulled in the direction of producing, right? Yep. Like I want to give to the community at DEF CON, but also there's such cool shit going on. I want to just go and just sit in all these talks. And I was so salty because a couple of the talks that I really, really, really wanted to go to this year just had hard conflicts with my own engagements. And I was like, so annoying. Okay, so let's go into some of the more advanced hardware stuff. We can go to BGA Reballing at some point, but let's hit the certificate pinning versus certificate validation section first and kind of talk about how certmitm does, takes advantage of that whole situation and what the differences between those two things are.
Yeah, so to start off, I'm sure every person who's looked at the scope of a bug bounty of a bug bounty program will see that certificate pinning is out of scope on every program, and mostly this in the mobile device context, but it's an identical situation in the IoT context, right? And so first we have to understand what the differences are, and it's really hard to understand the differences between cert pinning and SSL, like certificate validation, let's just call it that, because certificate pinning is just a stricter form of certificate validation. So if a device is doing certificate validation, if they're actually checking that the server is presenting a certificate that is signed by a trusted CA in its trust chain, but it's not pinning meaning it only trusts the leaf node, the server certificate, not just any cert signed by a CA in its trust chain, then that's fine. Like that's not a problem if they're not doing certificate pinning and not strictly saying, hey, you have to have this exact server certificate or a hash of it. There's different ways you can implement certificate pinning. But if they are doing neither of those, then that is a huge problem, right? It goes from being NA to like high or critical, depending on the context, depending on what type of information is being communicated in that TLS channel.
Because specifically, if it's not doing this validation correctly, you just have clear text access to everything that's happening through that device. Right?
Exactly. And it should, again, this is where you sometimes have to argue with triagers and stuff like that. I think it's getting better because there's becoming more understanding of these attacks, but understanding that should be network. That is a remote attack, because although oftentimes that attack is going to happen on the local network on the same subnet through ARP poisoning.
Oh, this is an interesting
point. Or like having control of the local router. Any router along the path between the IoT device and the server, if any of those is compromised, right? So if you want to get crazy, you can go look at like some of the like Snowden docs of like what one of the NSA programs alleged that they had the ability on internet routers to perform man in the middle of TLS traffic. So if you think of a threat actor like that, they don't need to be on your local network as long as they're along that path that the data will take from the IoT device to the cloud server.
Yeah, I mean, and think about when you're using, how many routers may be along the path in some of these public networks you're connecting to as well. I mean, it's a lot. It's a lot.
Yeah, if you've ever run a trace route, you see how many routers.
Yeah,
like. It's what we're saying is that any one of those routers, if they're compromised and can perform this man in the middle attack, then
that's very interesting.
Yes,
I wonder if that would be. I wonder what the trade-off is between in CVSS between adjacent and network versus attack complexity high, because what I'll see them do sometimes is when you want to make these changes, you'll do like. You'll flip one of the metrics and then add complexity high or whatever.
Yeah,
I don't know where it stands on it. And obviously I'm with you. I think it should just be network without the attack complexity high, because the risk is there. But yeah, do you know where it stands? I kind of want to see.
It's like, unfortunately, I understand the attack complexity high argument, but yeah, I actually kind of understand that trade-off. I hate to say this, because on the local network, it's trivial, right? Like if somebody is on the same subnet as you, they can ARP poison and get themselves in a position of a man in the middle quite easily. That is pretty trivial. Whereas you could argue, well, having an attacker have to compromise some internet router, that there is some complexity.
So I'm looking at it now.
Yeah, what's the trade-off?
Adjacent network will give you, in this specific scenario that I'm looking at, a 1.1 boost. And then if you move attack complexity to high, that will drop you down way lower. So it would be better for you to have just adjacent network.
To be adjacent network with low.
Yeah, than attack complexity high with network.
Well, I'll know what to argue for.
By a couple points.
From now
yeah,
on.
by 0.7 on the scale. So I mean, you're still landing within that high range. It's a high 7. The way that I've got it is like confidentiality high, integrity low, availability none, scope changed, user interaction none, privilege required none. Yeah. And then I'll switch the network and the attack complexity fields. And it looks like we're landing at like a 7.5 on the network attack vector with attack complexity high. And if we switch it to adjacent network instead of attack complexity low, we're looking at an 8.2.
Okay.
So I think the best bet there is to go adjacent network. We are bug bounty hunters right now. We are strategizing on what green hat, man, green hat all day. Let's go. Okay, so cool. So the important thing to understand here is if you can find a problem with the certificate validation in any of the services that are working on this device, calling back out, that could be a big problem. And I think there's more techniques. Obviously this really great talk by Oppo, right?
Yeah.
is really great for that. But if there's more ways for us to sort of test the implementation of TLS in this environment, that's great. I mean, that's you can really pop some impactful bugs from that.
You can, and yeah, when you're talking about how that's going to get rated, in my experience, it's always going to be based on what kind of data is being transferred in that, right? If it's just your metrics log,
right?
They're going to be like, No, that's not very. That's not very impactful.
Right.
But if there are session tokens in there, then that's an account that is account takeover, right? And so that is going to be impactful. And so,
and
even if there is attack complexity high or it's adjacent, I've had those be critical, be scored as critical if the data in there is really juicy.
Yeah, and CVSS isn't necessarily built for that environment either. So I think talking with the team, understanding their threat model, this is important in any area of bug bounty, but specifically in hardware stuff, that's important. And a high in the hardware world is like, what they say, two birds in the high. No, I'm not even gonna try. But a high in the hardware world, could pay as much as a crit in the web world. So,
it can
more sometimes. So.
And something important to point out, if you need ammunition for your reports, HackerOne's, I believe it's
platform standards.
Their platform standards. They have updated those to include certificate validation, and I think the default is a high.
Really?
Yes.
That's really cool.
So default is a high, and then various factors. So that's helpful if you need to include that in your reports.
That's really helpful, dude. Actually, I'm gonna look that up right now. Certificate.
Certificate validation.
Cool.
Is that
that's awesome. Yeah, they do have that. Wow, that's should be applied as a high, and they give you the CVSS 3.1 score. Very awesome, man. I love that. Thank you, HackerOne.
Link that in your reports.
Yeah, that one is going in the description for sure. Let me just go ahead and put that in there now so I don't forget. Perfect. Okay, great. So before we get on to the hacking stories and such, which I'm really looking forward to, let's hit this BGA reballing thing, man, because I am scared as heck of that. So essentially, my understanding of that is you've pulled a chip, it's a BGA, and you've cleaned it all off, gotten all the gunk off there, plopped it into a reader, probably modified the chip in some way, right? Like replacing, inserting your own certificate as a certificate authority. Maybe even added something to the OS so that you can get a shell or something like that.
Yep.
And now you are reattaching that device, or that chip back to the device, and then trying to boot the device back up and have it use that chip. So badass.
And then you're hoping that you see the light flash or whatever is the indicator that it's not completely borked. Yeah.
Right. Exactly. Wow. That is just such a badass technique. Talk to me a little bit about that, how difficult it is, and if you have any tips for it. You said you've done it a couple times, right?
Yeah, so this is a new skill set that I'm developing, and that's why I say with this hardware hacking stuff, like you can always hack on a device with less of the hardware hacking skills and then build them out over time. You're just adding these tools to your tool belt. So yes, I've done it about 3 times successfully.
Wow.
I've bricked a ton of devices. I've pulled pads off. But yeah, effectively what we have is
that's the word. I was looking for that earlier.
So we have a PCB. And it has so PCB is made out of it's etching copper. So there's a copper interface basically to your PCB, and then it cuts out around the copper. It cuts out copper so that you have all your connection points to where your different components connect to the board. And so so we're going to clean the pads on the chip, and we're going to clean the pads on the board. And then what we're going to do is you're going to use these BGA
and you're cleaning them with solder and a lot of flux, and you're trying to just get those guys all pretty looking.
And solder braid or wick.
Okay.
And so that's just a metal substance that, or like that you heat up, and then the solder is attracted to the braid and it takes it away from the PCB or your chip.
Okay, cool.
And when we're doing that, we want to be careful not to pull off any of these pads, right? Because these pads are connection points from the chip to the board. And so there's pads on the chip that you could accidentally pull off because if the solder gets cold and then you pull
Yoink it
on
off.
the braid, you're going to pull off those little pads on the chips or the board. But if you pull them off, you're not complete. You might not be screwed because on a 153 is a pretty standard BGA. There's ones with more. There's ones with like 200 pads and stuff like that. But on like a 153 BGA chip, I think there's like 12 pads that are actually used. All the other ones,
Really?
when you look in the data sheet, it'll say NC, not connected, or reserved for future use, which is effectively means it's not connected now, but maybe someday they'll create a new eMMC standard and it will be connected, right? But most of them are not connected, which means on the PCB side, there are just floating, like there are just pieces of copper circles where the chip connects that are not connected to anything under the circuit board.
Wow.
But the ones that actually do carry signals, they're going to go down under into the intermediate layers of the PCB and connect to some electrical component, right? To the CPU or something like that. The pads that are not connected to anything are way easier to pull off because of that. There's less resistance, right? They are literally not connected to anything. And so oftentimes, and it's funny when you look at the pinout for one of those BGA chips, all the pins that are used are on one side.
Oh,
and
my
one
gosh.
time I accidentally pulled off a ton of pads from the other side. And I'm like, oh, well, I'm screwed. And then I go and I look at the pinout of the data sheet and I'm like, wait, no, I'm fine. Like I pulled off like 20 pads, but I'm okay. You know, because all the ones that matter, the 12 or so that matter, were fine. And
that makes me feel so much better, dude. Like to know that out of this massive amount, there's like 12. All right, I just gotta get. There's only, if I pull one off, there's only like a 10% chance that is actually one that is necessary. You know? Yeah,
and it's even better than that because again, the ones that are easier to pull off are the ones that you don't care about because of the physics of how that works. So so when we clear that off, then what we want to do is we need to apply new solder balls to the chip so that we can reattach it. And so I've got these stencil devices that you lay the chip down in, and then you lay the stencil, which is just a metal shield. And then there's this solder paste. There's solder that's in a paste form that you can spread with a little squeegee, almost
That's
like,
cool.
and so you fill in all the holes of the stencil that perfectly sit on top of all 153 pads. And then once you have enough of that solder paste, you just hit it with hot air for about 10 seconds and they all just, they turn into perfect little solder balls.
I love that.
If you did it right. If not, you have to take it all off and start over again. But once you have those solder balls there, then you just put a light amount of flux on the PCB, not too much because otherwise it can like swim off to the side when you heat it up. But you blast it with hot air and then it reattaches perfectly. And then you boot it up and so you cross your fingers and you hope that you didn't screw something up.
Right. So when you're going back to chip off, when you're taking the chip off, let me ask you this: how hot are you blasting it with air? Like, what do you normally set it to?
I think I have mine set to like 750
Okay.
Fahrenheit. Yeah.
Thank you, Joel. That's what I'm saying. Like Joel was like, okay, so I actually made, I had a really funny meme in the presentation I did for DEF CON where, I put up like a particularly like a younger picture of Joel that's like, he was looking really cool and he like had his hoodie up and he's like looking like a hacker. And I put a bunch of like little bubbles, around his face, thought bubbles or whatever. And he's like, don't set your freaking hot air gun to like 700, Justin. You're going to burn the chip. Don't pull the board off before it's ready, Justin. I bricked like 3 devices this time when I was working with Joel on this. And so I so appreciated his guidance with that. But man, when you're using a higher setting on that hot air gun, it just goes so much faster, with that. I mean, we probably sat there and went over the chip for 20 minutes sometimes, and I think he's correct in that, you can burn up chips and you can cause problems, with higher settings and stuff like that. But that's so gratifying for me to hear. I love that.
I am not a scientist. Let me be clear. I'm an engineer. So like what works is what I do, right? Maybe not like the technically correct way to do things. Like that's how I judge these methodologies.
When I said it's 700, it goes so fast.
So that's why I do it.
That's great. I love that. So this is how you go from breaking it open to firmware in an hour, huh? You don't spend an hour.
Yeah. I don't got time to wait around for that.
Shooting it with hot air. That's great, man. Wow. that is an advanced technique, man. I'm still a little bit scared about that, but definitely more interested. I got to get myself some of that thread. I actually don't have any of that what is that? The braided wire that you were using.
Yeah. The braid,
and I saw in your videos, essentially you're just taking that and you're putting the soldering iron on the backside of it and just kind of rubbing it over those pads.
Yeah.
I think that is really, really cool.
Yeah,
we were trying to do something similar.
That's something that takes practice, because that's where you're likely to pull the pads off, because you're more likely to pull.
It's kind of odd using braids for that though, because I feel like braids have more texture to them and would be more likely to, like, if a corner of a pad is sort of like up a little bit, getting under it and like pulling it out. I don't know.
They are, and they do.
Yeah. All right. Very cool, man. Wow. My favorite time of the episodes has come. Let's talk about some bugs. So we've got missing secure boot on a device, and then, I won't spoil the second part. So take it away with this bug that you've prepared for us.
So so can't talk about the name of the device or anything like that, but it was a microcontroller based device, which again is usually the device that I'm not as good at targeting. But I think this story actually illustrates my point that even if you can't completely understand the firmware or something like that, you can still get something out of it, right?
Yeah.
Like, all these tools of hardware hacking, they help you solve a problem. They help you find vulnerabilities. You don't need to have all of them at once. So on this microcontroller device, probably the first thing I did was look for UART, nothing, look for UART, JTAG enabled, none of that's going to work. But it did have an external flash chip, so I wasn't going to have to do any glitching to extract the firmware. So this was one of these really easy, like 8-pin, I think one of the models of the device had a 16-pin chip, but pretty easy to remove and put back on the board. So I removed it, read the firmware out, ran binwalk. So this is a microcontroller firmware. It's just a binary blob of data. And so there's no file systems to extract. But what binwalk did identify in it are a few certificates. And I had already been looking at the network traffic that I saw from the device. I'd tried a man-in-the-middle attack. So I tried using man-in-the-middle proxy, which... so this is before I was using certmitm. I might have found a vulnerability. I might have found part 2 of this explanation a lot faster if I would have been using certmitm. So that's a good advertisement for it. But I was using man-in-the-middle proxy. So the way that man-in-the-middle proxy works by default is it has its server certificate has a CN. The common name is man-in-the-middle proxy. So, or man-in-the-middle proxy CA or something like that, right? And so then it forges certificates. So let's say the traffic that it's trying to intercept is going to www.example.com. Then it's going to forge a certificate with the server certificate is going to have the CN of www.example.com. And then it's going to sign it with the man-in-the-middle proxy CA, right? And then it's going to present that to the client and see if the client takes the bait, right? And in this case, the device was not taking that form of bait. So then what I did is so chip off and read the firmware, and I found that there were these certificates. They were in the DER format, which is a binary encoding. It's not like the PEM file where you see a bunch of basic 64 encoded stuff. It's completely a binary protocol or a file format. And then I was like, you know what? Okay, that's the CA for the traffic that I'm seeing going out to the internet. So what I'm going to do, and because I didn't understand anything about the microcontroller firmware. So I'm like, I need to generate a certificate that has exactly as many bytes as this other certificate. So I need a byte for byte duplicate of the certificate, but I need my key to be in there, right? So I worked with OpenSSL for a while and all the weird options that I needed to set to get it exactly the correct number of bytes.
Oh my gosh.
And so then I took the firmware and I knew the offset of their DER certificate. So I just used the DD command and like some of the arguments there.
Yeah, they have that in, yeah.
So in DD, you can say block size BS equals 1. And then so then you're doing things 1 byte at a time. You're dealing with bytes. As the block size. And then you can say skip. So you can skip a certain number of bytes, and then you can say size. So size says how many bytes you'll copy from the source to the destination. So I just very carefully, I think when I presented this finding, I had the Indiana Jones meme of like placing in. I'm just very carefully seeing if this cert, I can place this cert right in place of the other one, right where it was. And so I did that. Then I had a new firmware image, and I flashed that back to the chip, soldered it back onto the board, booted it up. And now, man-in-the-middle proxy can intercept the SSL traffic.
Oh my gosh,
so,
dude.
Not all IoT devices or manufacturers care about or have in their threat model secure boot. But this company did care very much about that. And they called this a high because I effectively proved that I was able to get modified firmware to boot successfully. By the chip, by the microcontroller.
Like I said earlier, Grub and like anything boot related is like not my shit. Like I do not like that at all. And so can you talk to me a little bit about what that process was like? I'm tracking with you. You pull the blob out. Obviously, this is a microcontroller system, so it's a little bit different than the way I'm thinking about it probably. But you figure out, you bin walk it, you figure out the offsets, you overwrite the cert. I'm tracking with you there. Writing it back onto that chip is something that I've never done. I mean, how are you doing that? Is that a part of the software you're using?
So this is going to be a difference between the way the eMMC readers work, because they just kind of mount as a file system on your computer, right? But the XGECU, that universal programmer that I use, when you do a read, you do a read of the whole firmware image on the chip, and you get an image back, one image of the full length of the chip, of everything that's stored on there. So then all I was doing is I was taking that firmware image, modifying my one little piece with the certificate, and then going back into that software. Again, it's not as direct as when you're doing things with eMMC. You go back into the software and you upload the file from your computer, the modified image, and then you do a write operation back to the chip. So it's all through the universal programmer software.
In the eMMC side, if you've got it just mounted like an SD card, you can just modify it in that file system and then just pull it out and slap it back on the device in that scenario?
Yes, you would be able to do that. Yeah, you mount it, read write, and that would totally work.
That's crazy, man. Yeah, and then I guess
if there was secure boot,
how does secure
that would
boot
get in the way of that, right? And secure boot definitions differ across manufacturers and stuff like that. But in the context of a microcontroller, right, that certificate I was modifying, I wasn't modifying a part of the file system. I was modifying code, right?
Yeah.
Like that certificate was embedded probably in like a C program that then got compiled for this microcontroller and loaded into Flash. And basically by me modifying it and getting it to boot and operate just normally, right? Except, with trusting my certificate instead of the other one.
Of course.
I was able to prove by doing that was like a way for me to prove that there was no validation of the firmware happening. And then, they confirmed that on their side.
So what they need to be doing is some sort of like check on the actual binary that is the firmware in these microcontrollers. And where would you even do that check from? Also, maybe they should have done a check on the actual certificate itself and said, in somewhere else in the code said, hey, has this certificate been tampered with? I don't know. How would they even fix that?
Yeah, so the typical way that secure boot is implemented is the actual microcontroller or the CPU will have some very small internal storage where you can burn in a public key. And then you, who are the firmware developer, have that corresponding private key, and you will sign the firmware with the private key such that a person with the public key, i.e. the CPU or the microcontroller, can perform that check, and it will halt the CPU if the signature doesn't validate.
Gotcha. Wow, that's pretty freaking cool, dude. Okay, so you were able to modify this microcontroller based firmware binary blob.
Yep.
You did it specifically within these offsets. You got a cert that would just create that at that length and that exact size, inserted it in there, fire it back up. Man, I can't imagine the rush of being able to see that traffic.
Oh, yeah.
You know? Oh my gosh, that must have been amazing. And then where do you go from there?
Yeah, so this is a funny part of this story of how I stumbled even into a larger, a more critical vulnerability. So I should note that new, firmware modified CA certificate that I generated. I didn't put the man-in-the-middle proxy certificate in there. I created one. Again, I wanted it to be exactly like the existing one. So I created a new self-signed cert that was the same common name, the CN of whatever CA they were using. I don't remember the name of it, but they were using some kind of certificate authority. It was probably an internal company certificate authority. And so I just kept that name exactly the same. So literally the only difference between my certificate and theirs was the key, was the public key portion of this certificate.
So this is actually kind of like the implementation of this certmitm attack.
It is.
That's one of those attacks. I think
I stumbled into. Yeah, exactly.
That's very cool.
And that's why I say certmitm would have caught what I found next.
Yeah,
and that is that. Okay, so if the device was 100% doing certificate validation the correct way, then within this new modified state, the device would only trust my fake CA certificate, not the real one from the real server, right? So I had to keep my man-in-the-middle setup running, in theory, for the device to be operational. Well, I was like doing something, I had some problem with my computer. It was probably the only time Arch Linux ever had a problem.
Oh, but, yeah, of course.
You never have to reboot that.
Never.
But I rebooted and I forgot to set up my man-in-the-middle setup again, and I turned the device on, and then I had this realization of I forgot to put my man-in-the-middle setup in there. The device probably isn't working now because it doesn't trust the certificate on the server in its modified state. And then I checked with the mobile app or some way, and I'm like, oh, it's working.
Oh, no.
And then I'm there's at this point, I'm like, there is something terribly wrong with the device firmware. And so you're right. I effectively performed the certmitm attack where I created a CA, only I put it on the device, not in the man-in-the-middle proxy, where it had the same exact, where I wasn't just faking the server certificate. I was faking the CA and the server certificate.
Right.
And it turns out that on this device, what it was programmed to do was programmed to check when the client connected to the TLS server and it got the server back. The only thing it was checking in that certificate was that the CA who signed that certificate had the CN equals to whatever string value it expected.
What the heck?
And so anyone obviously can craft a self-signed certificate with that value in there and perform a man-in-the-middle. And this led to account takeover because there were, it was the devices, all the devices' communications, which included its authentication credentials, were in that TLS.
I wonder if this type of attack is more common on microcontroller-based devices because they're not relying on, I say these battle-tested libraries. There's a ton of CVs that dropped with the certmitm thing of every TLS validation software out there had a CV, but they're not using these more trusted methods of doing that. They're often optimizing for size because those things, the storage on those devices are much smaller. So I wonder if they're cutting corners on TLS implementations.
You're 100% right. And so oftentimes when you get a certain brand or a certain type of microcontroller, you will be provided with an SDK that will include utilities for making web requests, connecting to Wi-Fi. And so, there will be a diversity of functionality. Whereas when it's a Linux device, if it's connecting to Wi-Fi, it's it's going to use WPA supplicant. It's going to act the same way every time.
Right.
Or when it's making a web request, it's they're probably using libcurl or, some common library, right? That is battle tested.
Yeah. You see a bunch more sketchy shit in IoT hacking stuff, which is really fun. I think that's one of the things that's really exciting about it too. So, all right, man. We've done it. We've made it through the whole doc. Thank you so much for doing this. This was a really eye-opening talk on IoT hacking stuff. Yeah, I'm definitely re-emboldened to go after IoT hacking targets when I can get my hands on a program to do that. So thank you so much, man.
Thanks for having me on.
Of course. And that's a wrap on this episode of Critical Thinking. Thanks so much for listening. And if you want more critical thinking content, head over to ctbb.show/discord. Join the Discord. There's lots of great conversations and chats going on over there. And if you want to support the show, there's the Discord subscriber tiers, which give you access to masterclasses, AMAs, hackalongs, exclusive scripts, and an exclusive chat channel with us. We'll see you there.